Hello, Albert.
Hi, Jeff.
So you are in the process of writing a book, and even that process is different because you're doing it in public. And as I had the opportunity to read it, you start off some chapters saying, this is still a work in progress. You make up excuses. Or help me out. Or I'm trying to rethink this, which I think is an open and collaborative process, which is wonderful. The book is called World After Capital. You, sir, are a venture capitalist. Are you putting yourself out of work?
That's the hope, yes. I think there's been a lot of innovation over the last few years that has reduced the amount of capital you need to start a company. There was a gentleman from Amazon, AWS, on stage earlier, and I sometimes joke that AWS has done more for IT startups than all VCs. So, but the reason the book has that title, World After Capital, is because more broadly speaking, capital was sort of the defining scarcity of the industrial age. And I think what we've accomplished through markets is that we have made capital formation very, very effective. So whether that's new factories, new buildings, new physical products, we can make them very cheaply, very rapidly. And we can create new capacity to make them very cheaply and very rapidly. And I'm calling it World After Capital because I don't believe that capital is the defining constraint for society anymore the way it was during the industrial age.
And you make the parallel to the agrarian age, to people who left their nomad ways to settle down, made huge changes. The industrial age made huge changes. And so you're making a bet that we're at the same kind of vendepunkt now in society, and that this notion of capital. So within that, then, the implications for society. You say in the book that we could do this well, we could do this badly. We have choices. But the clear implication is number one and first and foremost around jobs.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe go back and sort of restate that argument a little bit, because I think it's one of the central arguments of the book, which is the biggest mistake I see a lot of politicians making today is that they look at digital computers and they sort of go, well, we had, mechanical machines, steam-powered things, then we had electrical machines, and now we have digital machines. It's just another machine. And so they basically see it as a continuation of the industrial age. And that's a fundamental flaw in their thinking, because what digital machines can do is fundamentally different from what analog machines were able to do. And it's different along two very important characteristics. One is marginal cost. So the whole analog universe has marginal cost, and the digital universe has zero marginal cost. And then the other dimension along which is different is that in the analog universe, you have machines that are good at doing one thing, and in the digital universe, you have machines that can do anything. And so these two differences mean that our set of capabilities has expanded very dramatically. And the point about drawing a long history in the book is that whenever our capability set has expanded dramatically, that's when we've had massive changes in human civilization. So Homo sapiens is about 250,000 years old, and then, of course, many million years of evolution before that. But then there was sort of a long time period of living as hunter-gatherers, as foragers. And then we invented this thing called agriculture, which is a series of interlocking technologies. It's irrigation, it's domestication of animals, it's actually seeding things. And it completely changed the space of what was possible. And within that space of what was possible, there were some great things like the Athenian Renaissance, and there were some terrible things like the Dark Ages. And then it took another nearly 10,000 years, and we had Enlightenment, and we created steam power, electrical power, etc., completely, again, changing what's possible. But again, in that set of what was possible were incredible things like all the joys we now have of all the technological progress we've had, but we also had fascism and communism, and we had 2 world wars. And so the technology in and of itself just rapidly expands what's possible. It doesn't automatically get us to a good place.
I hear 2 arguments around our fate. Is that one argument says that in each of these revolutions, we used our new spare time and attention to be able to build new jobs, build new industries, build new economies. The other argument which you make is, no, we may be at an end point in terms of job growth, for example, because we don't have a scarcity to deal with there, which I want to come back to in a minute. But you have a prescription for this that will surprise people, I think, in terms of what society needs to do at this point at which we have sufficient capital and we have a surplus of time on our hands.
Yeah, so the reason I keep coming back to these big changes in the past is because in those changes, we change pretty much everything about how humanity lives. And I believe we're going to have to change pretty much everything again. And so in the context of changing everything, the one specific proposal, which is the proposal of universal basic income, maybe doesn't sound quite as crazy. So I think you have to first buy into the premise that this is a foundational shift. Once you take that lens, I think then suggestions that might otherwise sound pretty wacky actually begin to make a lot of sense. If you went back to the agrarian age and you had told people that everybody would be living in cities, that private property would exist everywhere, that we would have intellectual private property, I mean, all of those things wouldn't have made a lot of sense to most people during the agrarian age. So now if you say to people, well, there's a world that's possible where everybody has a universal basic income, people go, oh, I don't see it. Because people tend to primarily be influenced by what they've experienced in their own lifetime and maybe their parents' lifetime. And those lifetimes are dominated by the industrial age. So it may sound like a wacky proposal to give everybody enough money so they don't actually have to have a job and they can survive without a job. But once you're willing to pull back a little bit further in the perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And let me give you one analogy. So at the beginning of the industrial age, something like 80% of the population worked in agriculture. Today, in the US, it's sub 5%, and in most industrial nations, it's sub 5%. Now, if you look at the whole economy, if you look at our entire time today, you could think that, depending on how you want to cut the statistics, something like 50+%, depending on which the population you look at, maybe as much as 80% of our activity is economic activity. It's related to jobs. Well, why can't we think of a future where 20, 30, 50 years from now, economic activity is sub 10% of activity? It doesn't mean human activity goes away. It doesn't mean we stop doing things. It just means that just like agriculture has shrunk from 80% to sub 5%, economically motivated things could shrink from 80% to sub 10%. And that leaves lots of room for the pursuit of knowledge, for art, for spending time with friends, for taking care of children, elderly, cleaning up the environment. There's tons of things to do. What we have to decouple is the doing of things from the you do this because it's how you survive, it's how you get paid, and how you can afford to live.
It is hard to see how you get from A to B here without some kind of very wrenching revolution. So in a sense, the guaranteed income is a way to try to get there peacefully. No?
Yeah, it's just like the old joke where I stand in front of let's say the chancellery, and I ask somebody how to get to the hotel, and they say, "Oh, I wouldn't start from here." So, yeah, the problem with system change always is that how do you go from a system that consists of interlocking parts to a new system that also consists of interlocking parts? Now, I would posit that we aren't actually as far away as we might think if we had the political will. So a good example of this is Germany. So Germany has a system called Hartz IV, which is sort of the lowest rung of the social security system. And that is actually pretty close to a universal basic income, with the exception that they have a process called sanctions. And the government says, you shall show up for this job training, and if you don't show up, they cut the amount of money they give you. And it turns out a lot of that job training is useless and pointless and not what the person wants. And so they do show up, they do a completely shit job because they're not interested and keep collecting the money. Instead, if we turn the system around and just said, here's the base level, you just get this much money, go figure out what do you actually want to do. Actually, a lot of people want to do interesting things.
Maybe more productive, yeah. So one thing that strikes me, so I want to get to the heart of, I want to dare to argue with you on one point, but let me start here. In the media business, we control the scarcity. We control the printing press or the broadcast tower. We controlled attention. We controlled the dollars that went there. We had pricing power. Now we arrive in an age of abundance, and the value we had controlling scarcity goes away. You posit a new scarcity, which is attention. Let me start by asking this, though. Does there have to be a scarcity? Is there always a scarcity? Does scarcity drive society?
Yeah, I believe so. And attention is definitionally scarce. You know, we have 24 hours in the day, each one of us. When yesterday's day is gone, there's no way to reallocate your attention from that day. It's done. So it is definitionally scarce. It wasn't the binding scarcity. I think it's the binding scarcity now.
So here's where I'll argue with you. From a media perspective, certainly we tried to sell attention. We sold eyeballs by the ton. That's what we did, right? We said we have the public's attention and we can sell it to the advertisers, and that's why we made content, and that's why we had distribution and so on.
Well, you got usurped in that business by Facebook and Google and others.
Which are still relying on our old business model as long as it lasts, advertising.
Well, they're still relying on the idea that they've captured attention and they get to resell some portion of the attention that they've captured.
But I could, if you're saying everything changes, maybe that changes too.
Oh, it'll have to change.
So then is attention still the scarcity?
Yeah.
If it doesn't have that kind of value, that economic value anymore, then why is that the scarcity that drives?
Well, let's actually get to what I mean when I say attention is scarce. It's not just that you have a limited amount of it, it's that at the moment, we are not allocating it very well. So at the individual level, we tend to allocate a lot of our attention on how am I going to make more money? Or how am I going to buy this thing that I lust for? We spend very little time thinking, what is my purpose in life? That's why a lot of people have midlife crisis or end-of-life crises, because they realize they've spent their entire life doing stuff that they actually don't fundamentally care about. So the individual scarcity of attention is that we pay attention to things in our life that don't matter all that much when it all comes down to it, and we spend not enough attention on things that do matter, such as purpose and friends and family and so forth. And collectively, we have a huge scarcity of attention, which is we have massive global species-scale problems with things like climate change and infectious disease. If you think about the total number of people in the world who are spending their attention on how do we solve the climate change crisis, it is a small fraction relative to the scale of the problem. And then there are problems that we're not even spending any time on, as far as I can tell, or not any meaningful time. So, you know, the Earth hasn't been hit by a very large meteorite in quite a long time. Doesn't mean it won't happen again. Yeah. You know, the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud are full of stuff that could shake loose, and a lot of those trajectories end exactly here. And how many people are working on this problem today in the world? How many people are trying to locate those objects, work on the technology that we would require to deflect one of those objects? It's tiny. Why? Because the market cannot solve fundamental attention problems. Fundamental attention problems have to do with paying attention to things for which there's no price, and for which there cannot be a price because of the nature of the problem. So there is no price, for instance, for producing free content. It's free by definition, yet the world does incredibly well with free content. If you look at things like Khan Academy, they make education accessible to billions of people around the world. So we have an underproduction of free content as long as we're relying on market mechanisms to create free content. We have an underproduction of attention to asteroids as long as we think that market mechanisms are going to solve our attention problem to asteroids. Same goes for climate change. Same goes for how much time you spend with your friends. Same goes for whether you have purpose in life or not. These are not problems that the market can correct. By the way, I love markets. I invest in markets. Markets have brought us tons of amazingly good things. They've turned out to be the winning model of the industrial age. They won over government allocation of resources. Like, that is very clear. Now we have gone down this rabbit hole where we think every problem can be solved by markets because they've been so successful, at the very moment when we've reached the limits of what markets can solve for us.
So you're convincing me, but let me try to, maybe I'm just having a definitional argument, but I think that attention is only a path toward the greater ends that you've just listed. That maybe I would say that what's scarce in an operating society right now is involvement, engagement, intelligence, study, civility, empathy, outcomes, that the scarcity for the exact structure that you just put, the attention is fine. I can pay attention to something and still do something stupid. I can still pay attention and ignore it. I can still pay attention to things that are wasteful. There's a next step here, Albert, I think, in terms of how do we get to a better society?
Yeah, in the book, I talk about 3 freedoms. 3 freedoms that I believe we need to invest in as society that will allow us to allocate our attention to the very things you just described. And the 3 freedoms are economic freedom, which is the basic income we talked about a little bit. It's informational freedom, which has to do with who controls computation and information. And the 3rd freedom is what I call psychological freedom, which has to do with how do we react to this environment that is information supersaturated that we now find ourselves in. Our brains didn't evolve in this environment. Our brains evolved in an environment where when you saw a cat, it was an actual physical cat, not a video of a cat, of which you can now watch 1 million on YouTube. So I believe we need to invest in these 3 freedoms. The first 2, economic freedom and informational freedom, have a lot to do with regulation. The last one, psychological freedom, has a lot to do with self-regulation. How can we work on things like the somewhat trite term now, but I think important term of mindfulness, whether that's through breathing, through meditation, so that we don't wind up being slaves to Twitter, Facebook, you name it, because their business model is to grab as much of our attention as they can get. And it's a lot easier to grab your attention with a cheap emotional hook than it is by appealing to the rational side of your brain, which requires effort. So what do? They all devolve to the lowest common denominator of cheap emotional hooks and sort of psychological engineering at mass scale.
So one last point on this. So I started programs in entrepreneurial journalism and social journalism at CUNY, where I teach. And in each, I've seen that the key skill we have to teach the students is listening. That these institutions, economic or journalistic or political, have been bad at listening to many communities. Many communities feel that they're not heard, they're not reflected, they're thus not served. And then they don't trust us in the institutions, and thus we have an institutional revolution going on. So is there also a scarcity of the other end of attention, which is the attention of the public? Is there a scarcity of attention to the public?
There is. I think of this problem slightly differently, though, which is the real issue is that we have a narrative vacuum. We have mainstream politicians who basically keep saying it's just a tweak of the interest rate here, it's just a little retraining program here, and the people who you say are not being listened to, they go, wait a second, you've been saying this for 2 decades, and where I sit, it's just getting worse. Right. And you seem to be doing great and better all the time. So, there's a lot of conversation about empathy and listening and so forth. I also think there's a conversation to be had. We don't have a narrative of where we're going, and that vacuum, that gets filled by people who have retrograde narratives.
Yes.
That gets filled by the Trumps and the Brexiteers of the world who go, I have the answer, it's to go back to the past. Mm-hmm. And that cannot possibly be the answer, but we've left the field open because we haven't given a story of the future. And so I do think it's about listening, but I also think it's about storytelling. And there's a lot of people in the world who are craving a new story, a story that they can aspire to, that paints a positive picture of where humanity can go. And we have failed to deliver that story, and that vacuum has gotten filled by all sorts of let's go back stories.
Albert's book is a profound book. It talks about profound changes in society. And as we said at the beginning, unfortunately we're out of time, we can't have handled this in 17 minutes. But it is a work in progress too, where Albert very generously is saying, I haven't figured this out yet, help me. So where do you want these folks to help you?
Go to worldaftercapital.org and leave your comments or send me emails or hit me up on Twitter.
Albert, thank you very much.